Okay, so today we're going to be talking about derivation or talking about morphology. And morphology, we're kind of basically thinking again a little bit about words. And we're learning about how words are used and how they change. So think back to what we talked about in our last chapter about word origin and how words are made and what the word is that we use, that term for the study of words. And that term for the study of words is etymology. Now, you have some examples here to kind of help you review a little bit of what types of words we learned when we learned in that last chapter about etymology. We have the word interface, Google, and laptop. So these are some examples of different categories of words that you learned to identify. And I'd like you to think about this at the beginning of our lesson today to get you to review a little bit of what we had discussed last class. Today, though, we're going to be talking about anthropology a little bit. Ant, coming from anthropology, this is a little cartoon basically of talking about how words are made. So this cartoon is talking about how the little animal creature here is wondering why they're studying anthropology and why it's not called manthropology if it's about human beings, if it's not about ants. So we're going to talk about the origin and how words are created. Now, the word morphology itself, morphology, was really a biological term. And this term was used to talk about the study of parts of a different form and their functions. It could be animals, it could be insects, it could be plants, but basically studying the different parts of what makes it up. And we used this word morphology and adapted it to linguistic morphology to basically do the same thing, studying parts of a form and their function, but when it comes to language. And so we talk about the breakdown of how words are used and what their meanings are depending on the context in which they are being used. So that's what morphology is. A less complicated definition, basically the study of forms or the basic elements used in a language. An example would be in Swahili. We have this one word that means for English, for us in English, I will love you if it was directly translated. But, in Swahili, for us, we would probably just say I love you. And we're going to talk about the breakdown of how we form different words. So in this example, we have in Swahili, nitakupenda. And it's one word, but for us, it's multiple different words. So we're talking about how we have various words to convey the same meanings. Now, if you think back to our last chapters 5 and 6, we discussed morphemes, and we talked about what morphemes are. So a morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in a language. And its grammatical function can be basically to pluralize something, to tell me what tense I'm talking in, if it's past or present. So example, we have talks, talker, talking, talked, where talk is the common element, and the S, ER, ING, and ED are the other elements. So the smallest meaningful unit of language, for example, would be talk. Now, morphemes are not all words, okay? So when we talk about morphemes, we also talk about the word word, but what about the ed on worded, right? Walking. What about the ing? Redo, and then do. These are morphemes. So a morpheme is not necessarily just a word. It can be parts that create a word. We're going to talk about the breakdown of words. So if we look at this word reopened, there are three morphemes here. If I look carefully, I can see I have a word open being used right here, open. And so that's one of the parts of it, one of the elements. We also have and we have ed right here. So these are three separate morphemes. If I can break it down into different parts, these are the different parts I can break it down to. Open is just a unit of meaning in present tense. Means to do again, and ed shows that it's functioning as past tense here. So we're going to discuss morphology as compared to a fly, because I said it before, morphology is the study of a function or the different functions of a form. And I compare it to a fly because a fly is made up of different parts, just like many words are made up of different morphemes. Okay? And we use these different morphemes to create the function of a word. So the word open in our last example means something different from reopen, means something different from opened or reopened. All these words mean something different, and the different morphemes in those words help us realize the difference between all these words. So just as a fly needs all of its parts for different words need certain parts to explain exactly what they mean. If a fly does not have a head, which is, for example, its morpheme, these different morphemes that it's made of, then it does not function. And this is an example of a bound morpheme. If I have a fly with no head, the body cannot function, so it needs that head. A bound morpheme would be compared to this because a bound morpheme is a part of a word that cannot function on its own. So in our last example, when we talked about reopen or opened or reopened, re is a morpheme, open is a morpheme, and ed is a morpheme. I don't have a word that is just spelled re. I don't have a word that's just spelled ed. I have to use these in functioning with other morphemes. These are then called bound morphemes. But the word open, for example, would be free because I can use that word on its own. Here's another example. Tourist. Tourist has three morphemes yet again. I have tor is a word that can stand by itself. I have ist, and I have the s at the end because s is a form of plural. The ist means the doer or someone who's doing, creating the action, and tor is one unit of meaning. Just a noun. So this is made up of three morphemes. Tor would be able to stand on its own. This is what we would call a free morpheme. Ist and this that indicates plural are bound. They must be part of something else. Okay, so looking at these words here, the possible minimal units of meaning in the following words. I'd like you to think about identifying and breaking these words down first on your own. Okay, so our first word, I can indicate a difference here, farm and slowly, artist, friendly, tenderness, meaning, inspected. These are a couple of examples here. Corn versus a unicorn. And yes, this is not an actual unicorn, but corn, lots of corn, right? This is lots and lots of corn. It is a free morpheme. The word corn can function by itself. Uni before corn cannot. This guy is all by himself. He is unicorn. So, thinking about some bound morphemes that you know of, we've seen the S for plural, we've seen ed for past tense. Another would be the UN in uncommon. This is a bound morpheme because un is never going to function by itself. Now, in the word under, are there any bound morphemes here? This is a tricky one. I mean, people might think, well, UN is a bound morpheme, but then what about der? Der? I don't think I've ever heard that word before. So this is just one free morpheme by itself. Free morphemes thus can stand by themselves. They can stand alone, like the word under, right? Understand, the word understand would be two free morphemes in that case, right? So it's usually separate word forms which consist of basic nouns, adjectives, and verbs. Those are usually free morphemes. A lot of times we can think of a word, we might think of it as a free morpheme. Bounded morphemes cannot stand alone. They might end with or start with re, end with ist, end with id. All affixes are bound. Remember, prefix or suffix, all of those are called bound morphemes. The stem is what we basically talk about that everything else is attached to. In this case, for example, undressed. The stem is dress because my prefix and my suffix are bound to this word dress in the middle, and that is going to be my stem. It is a free morpheme in this case. However, it's not always this case, okay? Here's another example. Carelessness. Care is our stem. Lessness are our suffixes. They're both bound. However, we have examples such as the words receive, reduce, and repeat. I can say that the bound is re, right? Like my example for under before. But then what does sieve or deuce or peat mean? These words have no meaning. Sorry. These words have no meaning on their own. So these are still called bound stems. Now there's this other kind of morpheme. We're going to go ahead and break down the different types of morphemes you have. So remember, morphemes are different units of a word, the different parts that are put together to create a word. It can be it can be an actual word, but within the actual word, it can have prefixes, those are morphemes, suffixes, those are morphemes. Words put together, those are all individual morphemes. Now we have what's called a lexical morpheme. And well, we have our free ones, the ones that are just nouns, adjectives, or verbs that can hang out by themselves. They're words that carry the content of the message. So these are called lexical morphemes. Lexical morphemes, like I said before, are going to usually be nouns, adjectives, and verbs. If they can stand usually by themselves and they carry the most of the content of what we're trying to say, then these are lexical. So here are some examples of some nouns, some adjectives, and some verbs. We can always add words to our language, so this is an open class of words. Lexical morphemes always expand. We always add to them. Whereas there are going to be other morphemes called functional morphemes that we do not really add to. Functional are conjunctions, prepositions, articles, and pronouns. And here are some examples for you. These, that, at, the, nor, and, but. These are all functional morphemes. So we have lexical, and if you remember that lexical consists of nouns, adjectives, and verbs, then you can remember that all the other ones are going to be functional. Okay, derivational morphemes again. They are the bound morphemes that we can use to make new words or create a different grammatical category. Derivational means that we can go ahead and actually say we derived this new word from an original word. Derive meaning coming from, right? So that's how I remember derivational morphemes. For example, the word good. Oh, that's good. That's describing something. That's an adjective. But when I say, oh, it becomes goodness, adding ness to it, this bound morpheme, it becomes now a noun. Okay, so if it changes its function, if it changes it from maybe being an adjective to a noun or to a verb, then that is a derivational morpheme. Changing its grammatical category when we change it grammatically. So it changes, again, the grammatical class. If I need to remember what derivational morphemes are, that means it changes its category. It can take a lexical morpheme. It would take a lexical morpheme, right? Because lexical are adjectives, nouns, or verbs. And it would change it. It flip-flops from an adjective to a noun to a verb to an adjective to a verb. And if it can change its category like that, it is derivational. Now, sometimes, though, there are going to be other words, and you can refer to this on your own, that they don't change it from verb to noun to adjective. It might change maybe the tense. So it still functions as a noun, or it still functions as a verb. That does not change for the word, but it might change the verb tense, right? It might change the noun from one to multiple, to plural. So for example, these are the 8 that you'll always ever see. Basically, that's it. And it can be memorized easily because there's only 8 of them. But again, it just maybe makes it plural or singular, past, present, or present, comparative or superlative. And here are some examples to help you understand a bit better. So looking at these examples here, there are 8 types of inflectional morphemes being used right now. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds, probably a minute, to see if you can identify where an inflectional morpheme is being used. What is being added to a word maybe in here that changes it from singular to plural, for example, or from past to present? Jim's 2 sisters are really different. One likes to have fun and is always laughing. The other liked to read as a child and has always taken things seriously. One is the loudest person in the house, and the other is quieter than a mouse. Okay, so here are the examples. When showing possession, this would be an example. Showing possession from Jim to Jims. When we're talking about multiples, plural, sister to sisters. When we make it into the third person, when we're changing who is speaking or who's doing the action, in like or likes. When we are adding the ing to the end, like from laugh to laughing. When changing the tense, like into the past tense. Past participle, take, taken. Superlative, loud, louder, loudest, right? Superlative and comparatives. And in English, all inflectional morphemes are suffixes, which means they all come after. All these inflectional morphemes come after. So here it is, a little bit breakdown, a little bit more, so you have an idea. So what it'll do is an inflectional morpheme will take a noun or verb or an adjective and make these changes to it. So you know it's a noun if it has apostrophe S or an S added for pluralization. You know it's a verb if it has one of these forms. You know it's an adjective if it's a comparative or superlative. And here's a breakdown of what we just discussed together. So again, morphemes are the different forms that form a word, different forms that are put together to create a word. There are stems to these. For example, if I have the word understood, understood, or if I had the word retake, re is attached, that's a bound morpheme, and then take is an individual, a free morpheme. Perhaps that word take is the stem. Now we have the free and the bound. In our free morphemes, they can be lexical or functional. Remember, free morphemes mean they can stand on their own. Usually they're going to be nouns, verbs, or adjectives. And sometimes they can be functional, where we have articles, prepositions, pronouns, or conjunctions that we just discussed. Bound will either be derivational or inflectional. Here there is a mistake in grammar, and it's a very common mistake. I want to see if you can figure out what's going on here. We have, I was recently diagnosed with a fairly common middle-aged guy malady. Its cause, too much acidic food. Its cure, prescription drugs and a change in diet. Now when we do an apostrophe S, okay, that is not how we show possession, right? We're trying to show that it's cause, like it's possession to cause. So we shouldn't have an apostrophe here, nor for its cure. So the most important thing to remember, and of course, whenever you're told the most important thing, you know that you really should remember this. Inflectional morphemes do not change the actual category. They keep it as is. If it was an adjective once, it will still be an adjective when it's an inflectional morpheme. The ER being added here at the end, which all inflectional morphemes in English always are added to the end, is an inflectional morpheme, and it does not change its meaning. Derivational means it can change it. For example, teach is a verb, teacher is a noun. So ER is being used in each of these. Yes, it is being used in each of these. But depending on what is being used with will tell you if it's inflectional or derivational. Okay, so like I said, it's both inflectional and derivational, depending on what it's doing to the word. So for example, in the word quiet and quieter, or farm and farmer, a farm or is like from to farm, it can be a verb. A farmer would be the noun. And that's why that's derivational. Inflectional is using a comparative. Quiet, quieter. They still have the same meaning. They're not changing noun, adjective, verb. Nothing there is changing. So a little comparison for you from what we've discussed the past couple of weeks. We said phonology uses phonemes. Phonemes are abstract. Phonology studies abstract form of phones. Phonemes, remember, have the slashes, burnt, where we can just break a word down, whereas the phones are the actual bracket representations of the sounds when we're trying to teach someone how it's pronounced. Well, phonology, like morphology, uses morphemes, which are the abstract forms of morphs. See how that works? Okay. That's the basic breakdown and study of morphology. Now we've discussed before this whole allo, because we had it before, allopheme, right, before in our other chapter. And here we have allomorphs. Or sorry, not allopheme, allophone, now allomorphs. So they're called allomorphs of the same morpheme, sorry, or a group of different morphs. All versions of the same morpheme. Allo means they're pretty similar, close related. So in the case that we were looking at before, if I can go back here. When we were pluralizing, we saw that for cars, we would just add one S, but for buses, we would add an E and an S. Okay, so these are called allomorphs because they're both indicating plural tense, for example. They're both functioning in the same way. Of course, you have exceptions to every rule. We have an example here, one sheep, two sheep. This is called zeromorph, right? Nothing is changing. Even though we're talking about plural over here in the other form, there's no actual change being done to the word, so this is called zeromorph. Now, with the words man and men, there's still no other adding to the word but change, okay? And these are because these are irregular. And of course, we can indicate this change in sound with the phonetic symbols. And there's, of course, also that's pluralizing sometimes. That's a little bit irregular, but also creating past tense forms. We have verbs that are irregular, right? Go in the past becomes went. We don't simply add an ed. And different languages will have different other forms and patterns that play into the roles of the same morpheme.